No prizes for guessing the topic, I guess, or looking even at the contents from the wonderful lineup you have for this conference. I can see that maybe some of the great speakers you had lined up are still here, but speaking about something else than what they envisioned a while ago. So I thought I'll try to do something that connects the topic that interests or obsesses everyone right now, which is the crisis or pandemic, the COVID-19 age, with two areas that I know some people are interested in general, in the context of this organization, this network, and this conference, which is leadership and data. And the background to this presentation is that even though I live in a bubble made up of many data scientists and many people who see themselves as evidence-based and fact-driven and hyper-rational, and who are no doubt very smart, you still end up having bar-like or pub-like discussions on whether this leader is doing a good job or a bad job, on whether this country or this organization will be in trouble or not. So the question really that I set out to ask is whether we can truly answer these questions in an objective manner, looking at data and leaving aside our political preferences. So I will focus on political leadership, but this is really an attempt of making or giving an apolitical view of the situation, which I know might be naive, but I'll try nonetheless. So the pandemic clearly raises many leadership questions. Some questions asked by normal people, some questions asked by data scientists, people geeks, HR professionals, people analytics, who are, of course, sometimes also normal people, mostly normal people, of course. So the question on the right might apply to everyone, including HR professionals. And by the way, I really don't have the answer to the question of whether we will have a second season of Tiger King. But if you do know the answer, I'm sure you will enlighten us and share it in the Q&A time. Maybe this is the question everyone wants to answer right now. But more seriously, we have questions on the left that have occupied researchers, academics, and people analytics practitioners for some time. Not just answering the questions, but using those answers to inform and shape data-driven decisions in organizations. So is my leader data-driven in any way? Am I leading in a data-driven way? Are my measures of leadership effective? What are the predictors of group level performance? How much of the variability in a group, and in this case, I'm going to focus on societies or social groups such as countries, can truly be attributed to the leader? How much of it is circumstances? And the question that everyone is asking right now, I mean, it's probably the question I get asked the most right now. Do we need to revise our models of leadership? Are the models or theories of leadership being rewritten because of these unprecedented circumstances? So let's start with this question, the last one, whether we need to revise our models of leadership. And of course, the science of leadership is very well established. We have something like 100 years of independent scientific evidence exploring the traits that make people better leaders, worse leaders, what are the conditions that make people better leaders, worse leaders, and what are the main characteristics of high-performing teams and groups. But it's fair to assume that perhaps because we're living through unprecedented times, we need a very different model of leadership. In other words, that the key attributes that make leaders effective right now are different, somewhat or totally different from the traits that make leaders effective in general. So, in other words, or in simple terms, do we need different leaders during a pandemic? So what do we mean by a pandemic first? A pandemic is a crisis. It's a situation of high uncertainty, risk, complexity, low familiarity. By the way, I really mean these words, right? So up until January 2020, even March 2020, when we talked about uncertainty, risk, complexity, agility, VUCA, we use these words in the very light and superficial HR meaning that they have, which is, okay, there is technological disruption, AI is coming, etc. Now we're talking about substantial uncertainty, high risk, threatening circumstances, low familiarity, and total novelty in many senses. So to deal with these situations, leaders need to be And I'm highlighting 4 attributes that really differentiate between high-performing and low-performing leaders in these circumstances. They need to be smart, mostly because experience doesn't help. So you need to have raw mental horsepower and high cognitive capacity to learn from the novel experiences you're thrown into, and reason and make sense of chaos. And ideally, use data and facts to do this. You need to be empathetic, truly interested in others, caring and considerate. Nobody wants to follow a leader who says, me first. Some people, of course, are forced to, but in general, it's preferable to follow leaders who are altruistic and empathetic. Humble, in other words, aware of their limitations, willing to learn with a genuine desire to understand problems and develop. And ethical. Leaders need to have integrity. When a situation is extremely adverse and threatening, people must be able to trust their leaders. We are, in a way, forced to trust our leaders now because we have no alternative, so it helps if they are ethical and have integrity. So what is the answer to the question, in a pandemic or in a time of crisis, do we need a different type of leader? The answer is yes. In tough times, including a pandemic, we do need a different type of leader, namely a competent leader. Rather than illustrating this with photos of the leaders, pick your favorite example of the typical, atypical, competent, incompetent leader. But I did want to share some very, very well-known stats and data on how common low competence or incompetence in leadership is, not just in politics, but also in business. And the best exercise you can do to find out about that is just Google "my boss is" and see what the autocomplete function in Google turns out, right? That is somewhat affected by geography and language, but mostly you get things like toxic, destructive, abusive, incompetent, etc. We also know that 80% of employees are not engaged at work. I think a couple of days ago, Josh Bersin published a really interesting and thought-provoking post on why this working from home and disrupting old ways of working might be the best thing that has ever happened to employee engagement, because clearly it wasn't working before. We also know that a lot of people are passive job seekers, looking for other opportunities, or maybe at least hoping for, if not waiting for, other opportunities. Most LinkedIn users were open to a better job even before the crisis came. And self-employment rates have been steadily on the rise, even in places where unemployment figures have been low. That's the world of business. In the world of politics, how common is incompetence? Very common. So, probably we don't even need to go there, but 70% of the people, according to various and most kind of mainstream polls, don't trust their governments right now. As of today, I think COVID-19 deaths surpassed 200,000. These figures are sadly outdated by the day. Natural disasters kill about 6 million people per century. In the 20th century alone, deaths due to anthropogenic disasters, so deaths by government, amount to about 212 million. So yes, we have natural disasters, but actually bad leaders are much more harmful and toxic for individuals, whether they're running businesses or countries. And what's interesting about the pandemic is we have, on the one hand, the intersection between the human element here that is at play with leadership, and then the influence of natural or extraneous forces, extrinsic situations like a virus or a disaster. We also have a lot of data, right? So we also have a lot of data. As said, this is now 4 days old, so outdated, but we are bombarded by data, and everyone seems to think they are an armchair epidemiologist, an armchair expert in viruses and viral infections, and of course, a leadership expert, because leadership is under scrutiny like it never was before. So you can look at statistics, which are interesting because what it tells us is variability between different countries, or if you click on a specific country, you can see variability within country. But if the question is, what does it actually mean, or what does it tell us about leadership, you have to be careful before you jump to conclusion, because data are much more nuanced than we typically think. Yes, we come up with generic recommendations as to what people should do if their goal is to keep people safe. And let's assume that that is the goal of governments and leaders. There's no reason to be cynical here. So if that is the case, we seem to copy what other countries do, and in some instances, these are quite obvious measures where we are increasingly seeing less and less variability or differences between countries. Then, however, you can group them and look at actually what are the different bets that different countries and really different leaders are making to solve the problem better than others. And so, to what degree are things like social distancing effective? Do you need a national or regional lockdown? How much testing do you need to do? If you, of course, have to pick between these measures, because there are always trade-offs. Should I invest in masks versus hospital beds? And what are the factors that you can generally influence now versus some things that are historical? Then you can see that leaders make choices, and choices have consequences. Okay, so in a way, we are witnessing a real life experiment in leadership. And the question that we try to answer is, firstly, what lessons should leaders learn and apply, right? So if everyone is watching and we're trying to look at what works and what doesn't, what should we implement and what should we ignore? So if you want to think about the equivalent in the world of business, this is like a fast-track, turbocharged and pulse version of let's meet to reassess our strategy, see what our competitors are doing, what's working, what can we implement, and how can we execute on our strategy, right? So I'm just highlighting some recent examples or examples that have caught the media attention. In the US, which is in a different situation from Europe right now, but I know the eyes of the world are often on the US for different reasons. I would say that the best predictor of what measures different states implement today are politics rather than data. Okay, so if you want to predict whether a state will implement lockdown, how much even the narrative of the conversation is guided by let's get people back to work versus let's get people safe. I'm not saying that the only factor is politics, but politics is the main predictor of the decisions leaders make. Why is that the case? Then you can drill down into the data and see if that overlaps with other confounds there or not. Should you wear a mask or not? And in some countries, including some European countries, this image is already heretic because you're not supposed to have a beard under your mask. In other countries, that is total news and people don't know. What is the trade-off between damage to the economy and damage to health or lives? Should we allow dogs to be walked out? Should we allow people to take out their kids? Just a couple of days ago, Spain eased out on the restrictions for kids to go out. But before that, people could walk their dogs. And there are all these jokes that I'm sure you received on how, one dog says to the other, "Oh, I've never been taken out for a walk so often as now. Can I stay at home, please?" And really interesting questions. Are approval ratings indicative of leaders' actual performance, right? And just two examples here. So Governor Andrew Cuomo, whose approval ratings have risen dramatically since the crisis started and has been praised for his briefings, has achieved or attained rock star status now in a state where he didn't have it. And yet, if you try to correlate that with the performance of New York and compare that to other states, it's questionable whether his approval ratings are a function of the results that New York is getting, that he is getting, or other things that are more stylistic. This is a very recent picture on the right, someone who decided to get a tattoo of Sweden's chief epidemiologist. Now, Sweden is under scrutiny right now because it stands out for not implementing strict lockdown measures, or strict social distancing measures. And on the other hand, inside the country, you have people who actually appreciate that and who have elevated their epidemiologists to rock star status. Are women more effective at managing the crisis? Something that has been asked, in a way, some, if not all of these questions are questions that we've been asking before, but now they have received more interest and more attention because what's at stake is clearly the well-being, welfare of teams, groups, organizations, and countries. And we're looking at what impact leaders have. So lots written on this as well. So the main question that I want to ask and that I want you to reflect on is whether we can genuinely answer these questions with data, right? So we have all these mantras that we love, and as a profession, people analytics is trying to inject a much needed dose of rationality and evidence to the HR profession. And I do think that's where the data science is applied to work. But we also have to be aware of the challenges and hurdles that we face when we're trying to persuade people of things they don't want to be persuaded of, even when you're armed with rational arguments and a lot of information. I know that some of the work done by the leaders of this conference, certainly David Green and Ian Bailey, we work with them to emphasize on or highlight the importance of things such as storytelling, political influence, and emotional intelligence if you want to be a leader in people analytics. It's not enough being a great data scientist confined to an obscure windowless basement and looking at data and coming up with great insights. If you can persuade people that they should act on those insights or pay attention to you and that your insights are valuable. And that's not just done with rational arguments and logic, but also with social skills and politics. So I think COVID-19 is a real-life leadership experiment. Again, we often talked about real-life experiments in much more superficial and trivial contexts. This really is the case today. Why is this the case? First, every leader faces the same challenges and is put through the same tests. Secondly, every leader is under intense scrutiny. The stakes and exposure are very high. Third, every leader is being compared to others. This is where the natural or standardized element of the experiment comes in. And four, there are a range of standardized and normative data or KPIs to measure performance. But an abundance of data doesn't make things easier. It actually makes things more challenging because we have so much data to choose from and so many nuances that are needed when you try to interpret that data or translate it into insights. Nonetheless, our key assumptions still hold, and these are very well-established, old-school, traditional assumptions from the science of leadership. The first is that groups, and by groups we mean social units, so societies, businesses, organizations, differ in their ability to adapt to a crisis, and the current pandemic is no exception. Meaning, some are dealing with it better than others. We could have expected that in the beginning. We are seeing this now. The second one is that we can measure these differences with a range of quantitative indicators, pandemic data comparing how different groups are impacted. The third assumption is that some of these differences can be attributed to leadership. And some of you might remember the old quote from the world of advertising or marketing in the 1960s. Half of the money I spend in marketing is wasted. The problem is it's hard to tell what half that is, which 50% that is. So with assumption C, some of these differences can be attributed to leadership. It's very hard to know which ones, right? So even today that a lot of attention in the field of analytics has focused on reverse engineering or unpacking, double-clicking in black box models of AI to understand what the logic is, it's much harder to even unpack or open up the black box of the human brain to understand to what degree decisions are rational, to what degree things that we see, even big differences between groups, have followed a rational train of thoughts or were truly motivated by good leadership, vision, strategy, etc. And D, this is the sad state of affairs, but I think it is a data-driven conclusion, if you like. No data may be enough to persuade people to change their views on leaders. I think it was Yuval Harari in Homo Deus, where he talks about storytelling and making up myths and basically creating artificial meaning as one of the main traits or characteristics of Homo sapiens, where he actually makes a really, really compelling points. The more unbelievable the story that the leader asks people to believe is, so the more, the crazier, more irrational, and more unbelievable the story, the more commitment and faith people will need to show on that leader. Because if it was that rational, if it was that obvious, you don't even need leaders, or you don't need leadership to come and put forward a vision and connect with people and ask them to do something they wouldn't do by themselves. So this is very interesting because sometimes it is the case that the more data you have, the more you realize that it's hard to persuade people to change their views. Nonetheless, we have a lot of data, right? So we have a lot of data. And I don't want to go into the data, and we don't have time today. I'm sure some questions on the data will come. But just to give you a really, really simple example, right? So if we wanted to compare how countries are dealing with the pandemic, what do we look at? Do we look at total number of cases? Do we look at total number of deaths? Well, the populations are different, so you need to weigh that by population. Okay, so we do that pro rata or per capita. But then, small countries over-index, large countries under-index. Can we even trust these figures? Every day we see reports of countries accusing other countries that they're making up their data. Every day in many countries we see reports of the media that their own countries are making up the data. So can we trust the data? And even if we do, what data should we look at? This is just rank ordering countries by total number of cases, which of course is also affected by number of tests. So ironically, testing, which should be a good thing, makes you look worse. And that's just one indicator. If you rank order countries by other indicators, such as number of deaths by 1 million people in the population, we see a very different order of countries. So this is just taking two related and relevant and quite obvious indicators, number of cases, and you see the top countries, USA, Spain, Italy, France, Germany, number of deaths per 1 million people. These countries, in some instances, don't even appear in the top 10. Looking even at single, more nuanced and perhaps specific indicators, you can see in some instances that some variables seem incredibly predictive, but they might predict outliers or exceptional performers, or help us understand why some groups don't fit the norm, right? So this is data published recently by McKinsey showing how healthcare capacity, so number of intensive care unit beds, predicts the lower spread of the virus. And you can see, if you were to just look at this indicator, you would say, bingo, I know why Germany is doing so well. But of course, there are so many others, and you can show or pick other indicators where Germany maybe one would not have predicted it to do so well. So the more data you have, the more you can cherry pick, and the more access to theories you have to interpret the nuances that data might be covering or be revealing. As I said, our intervention is driven by science or politics. So even if we can make steady inferences or predictions on the virus, what's happening with the virus, should we be looking at rational facts, data, and evidence to predict what politicians are doing? In other words, it might be that politicians have access to the data, they can interpret that data in a reliable and meaningful way, but they still decide to act on politics because that's more convenient for themselves or for the country. I mean, here you can see, and I'm not overlaying this with voting intentions, but if you basically chart voting in the US in the last 50 years, you can see a strong correlation between Republican states in red and Democrat state in green. So basically what we have is a very simple model that, despite its apparent simplicity, still should highlight the complexities that we're dealing with. And by the way, I cannot emphasize enough that I'm talking about politics because it's easier than to pick real life examples of corporations or business leaders. We all know what's going on in the world of politics, or at least have an idea. But this is a diagram and a model that has applied to every people analytics effort to try to drive data-driven changes or actions in their organizations. So no difference whether we're talking politics here or whether we're talking business. So we have data, which are, in this case, records or indicators of COVID-19 cases across regions. And data alone, data without insights, are meaningless. How do you translate that data into insights? You need science, but you also can make political interpretations of that data, right? And this is something politicians have done very well, even before they work out how to act on that data in a scientific way, they know how to leverage or take advantage of the political aspect or interpretation of that data. By the way, this happens also in organizations. Business leaders have to be politicians or exercise political skills in an organization. So we don't have a perfect passage or transition from data to insights. It's mediated by science, which is data plus theory, and by politics, which is your own self-serving interpretations of data. And even if you get to insights in a good way and you have meaningful interpretations of data, not just descriptive, not just predictive, but also explanatory, where we can truly understand the phenomenon in question better, you still have to act on those insights, right? So action is data-driven changes in beliefs and behaviors resulting from those insights. And there's a difference in beliefs and behaviors, right? Even if you think about more autocratic governments might force people to act on their insights, as in, if you go out of your home, I will imprison you or fine you. And in other cases, that's a change in behaviors. So I might not change your beliefs, but I threaten you or use coercion or extrinsic motivation. In other cases, I might be more interested in changing your beliefs. Hey, it's for your own good and your family's and friends' good that you should stay inside, blah, blah. And I think this is where leadership comes in. Leadership is, in many ways, a way to translate insights into actions. Leaders today need to look at the insights that their team of experts have drawn from those data and decide what to do and how to advise people to act. So it's a really simple model with just three elements or phases, but you can see that there are a lot of nuances in between them, and we don't automatically go from one to the other. So it's not that easy to tell people I'm data-driven, or we're a data-driven organization, or a data-driven nation. And this takes me back to a very old and well-known problem in leadership research, which is the attribution problem. We have always distinguished, and there has always been a very passionate debate between interpreting differences in group performance or group differences in performance, including how organizations and countries perform, to either external factors. In this case, we can talk about weather, density, demography, things that are external, but are also the result of the historical legacy of the values of leaders, things we call culture, how we do things around here in this country, in this organization, in this company. Random or arbitrary factors, what previous leaders have done, reverse causality, and internal factors, which are really the ones that are at stake when we're saying, hey, look, my leader is better than yours because my country or my team is doing better, right? So there was always been a very heated debate. And this debate is somewhat artificial because in reality, there's a connection between internal and external factors. As I said, so for example, if you talk about things like that are contextual, equality or education, well, it didn't just happen out of the blue. They're the result of what previous leaders and governments have done. And equally, leaders are often chosen as a consequence of certain norms or values that are in place in a certain culture. So they're intertwined, right? But what I'm trying to say is that really, to make this a real life experiment, you would have to do things that are impossible, such as switch around Merkel and Trump and see what happens, and then also have a control and then switch them around 100 times and pick different countries so that one leader can say, well, you know, I can't be doing better because I'm running this country and not this other country, or switch around Boris Johnson with Vladimir Putin and see what happens, so that we can truly identify the influence of internal versus external factors in the situation. That would be a nice experiment to do, by the way. I'm sure some countries would sign up for it quicker than others, but it's not going to happen. So, to conclude, data, politics, and leadership in the pandemic crisis, what can we say? Well, we can safely assume that data are just symbols, mostly zeros and ones, that science equates to data plus theory, meaningful interpretation of data with testable predictions, falsifiable hypotheses, and replicable findings, and that politics are explicit or implicit attempts to contaminate the interpretation of data for self-sovereign purposes. Even the explicit side of it will be problematic, but imagine if we also bring in the implicit side, things like confirmation biases. People generally prefer to be right than to understand the world. So because of the three first points, we can use data to evaluate the performance of leaders, even in a pandemic, and we can also reach very unscientific conclusions. At the end of the day, science is not about being right, but finding better ways of being wrong. And the process should be incremental, where we constantly get new data, inspect it, and test existing theories to refute them or support them. So the key problems really are, can we trust the data? Can we trust our leaders? Can we interpret the data? And can we interpret our leaders? Some of these are easier to address than others. An even bigger problem is that most humans, if not all humans, are generally more interested in being right than in understanding problems. Leaders take advantage of this issue by doing what they do best, politics. And we haven't even discussed the media, which is really a third force that really contaminates the natural passage from data to insights. But we won't go there. I'm sure some of the questions might tackle this as well. That's all I wanted to share with you. For more information, you can look at some of the books I've recently written on the subject. The last one, Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders, talks about these issues, although at the time it was written, I didn't know we would have a crisis or a pandemic right now, but it is oddly still very timely. And I would say, unfortunately, still very timely today. Thank you very much. So I think we can open up to Al and the Q&A now.
Yes, Thomas, thank you very much. I mean, it's such an important topic to explore because you highlight a lot of influences, and this is where I want to start. Historically, whether it be an individual or a leader, there's been this thirst for certainty. Where I feel that I have enough information, and if I do B, if the situation is A and I do B, then C is going to ensue. Now, if the situation is the pandemic and I, as a business leader, do B, I have no idea if C is going to not ensue. So most of the people listening, I would think, are involved in data and analytics and bringing insight to these leaders who are in turn making decisions. So this thirst for certainty, how would you coach us who are producing the insight and or those who are consuming it and getting away from this kind of need for certainty?
Yeah. So, and it's tricky, right? Because we have been celebrating traits such as tolerance for ambiguity, openness to ambivalence, flexibility, adaptability, and all of that. So I would say the term that I like the most is low need for closure, in that you're happy navigating uncertainties. So we've known that is a good thing, and we've been celebrating it for the last 2 decades because the world has changed faster, etc. We can do that. I mean, it's not that easy to suddenly turn somebody who is very dogmatic, conservative, and narrow-minded into a kind of divergent thinker and somebody who is high open and high curious. But even if we could, there is a downside to doing that, because at the end of the day, most people still want meaning, answers, and now that you are in a seriously unfamiliar and uncertain situation, we want that more than ever, right? So it's like, I'm going to change gears here a little bit, but why do big systems of thinking, from philosophy to religion and science, deal with metaphysical things like what happens after we die? Because the uncertainty is so great. Whereas if the question is, is this place selling decaf soya latte, you can answer that question very quickly, and you don't need religion or metaphysics, right? So I think this is what makes the situation more delicate in a way, and why we need leaders more than ever who are smart, trustworthy, empathetic, and who care. because people need answer and they will trust whatever leaders say right now. That's why approval ratings generally go up in a crisis. Now, all my eggs are in your basket, please save me. So in those situations, I think leaders don't benefit from saying, oh, well, everything goes, let's see what happens, the world is VUCA, and I'll just go with the flow. You actually need them to be more dogmatic and to create certainty where there is none, which maybe explains why authoritarianism is a natural default tendency, even in leaders who are more democratic during these times, and why even people who espouse or propose a more democratic leadership style say, hey, in these times you need to be definitive and make decisions, and indecisiveness is the worst. Whereas from us, from a pure data scientist perspective, you keep your options open, explore, have an open mind, etc. That doesn't work now when people want answers. And leaders need to make up those answers. If they make them up for their own purpose, we're toast.
It's challenging because part of me, as I'm listening to you, wants to accept the fact that, this is a situation where each decision is suboptimal. And then it invites the question, how much do I communicate that? I think of Brené Brown, The Power of Vulnerability. So how much do I say that I don't know and still inspire confidence and still remain open-minded and seek to learn versus, to that point, okay, I'm just going to be an authoritarian, make a decision, and everyone's going to have to deal with it. I mean, can you talk to how that balance might, evolve for an individual?
Yeah, and the balance will be different depending on the culture, right? So I'm going to pick random countries, but it's probably the degree to which people, so citizens in a society or the group, your followers, will want to see optimism, certainty, strength, as opposed to vulnerability, rationality, and uncertainty, will be very different in, I don't know, South Korea and Hong Kong than in maybe Russia and Brazil. Actually, it's unfair to even make comparisons between countries, because you can pick any country and within that country, you will see stylistic differences that correlate with personal preferences, political preferences, right? I mean, me personally, as an individual, I would be more comfortable with a leader who tells me this is very hard, they are vulnerable, they don't know if they can deal with it, they're going to try their best, and they actually don't know what the answer is, because that's my assessment of the situation. So I'd rather have that than somebody who conveys a relatively false sense of optimism and stability. But I know that I'm an exception. And if leaders did what works for me, countries will be devastated and depressed. So leaders need to manage that tension, that balance, know what's best. But even before we get to that point where they need to decide what narrative they adopt and how to connect, they need to work out what the problem is and how to solve it. And I think as much as it's difficult and we might not see or know who has a solution yet, it would be very naive to assume that right now all countries are dealing with this equally well and leaders play no role whatsoever. That nihilistic assumption will be trivial, I think, and naive. Not trivial, it will be naive and actually self-detrimental. It's a bit like saying in an organization or a business, don't worry about who we appoint as a leader, because at the end of the day, this is the shit theory of life. Situational circumstances, external forces might determine everything. So it doesn't matter who you appoint,
Right.
Let's see. That would be very, very, a very dangerous experiment.
Well, in your book, which, by the way, I have right here, and obviously we don't have time to go through it, but one of the many things that you spoke of that touched me is that if we have better, more, I forget the term that you use, I want to say altruistic, fair ways of assessing leadership, then more women would rise. And now we look at the countries that have women leaders, and by many measures, they have outperformed in terms of minimizing the spread of the virus. And obviously, we don't want to make projections, at just, okay, let's just promote more winners or women. It's more about, if we have a better understanding of what we're looking for in a leader, then that environment will be created for women to be elevated. Did I summarize that correctly? And can you, share a little bit of your insights and ideas on that?
Yeah, so first of all, we could have done the whole session on gender and leadership alone, because you could apply the same thinking and the same models, right? So firstly, people are asking the question, are women managing the pandemic better or not? And they're asking it for various reasons, but I think largely that question is motivated by a desire to explore whether the current gender differences in leadership emergence, the fact that many more male leaders exist than female leaders, whether that's meritocratic or not. So people are asking the question because they say, okay, this is the biggest leadership experiment in our times. How are women performing, right? So should we ask the question? Yes. Do we have the right, or are we inherently or intrinsically motivated from a curiosity standpoint to know the answer? Yes. Can we answer that question with data right now? In a very imperfect way, right? In a very imperfect way, because there are 10 or 15 women running countries versus 185 or 190 men. So already anybody with limited knowledge of statistics will know this is a very imbalanced sample size, or sample sizes to compare. And then all the things that I just mentioned apply, plus you bring in gender, right? So it's a bit like, we could look at whether taller leaders are dealing with it better, and you're probably going to find more rigorous answers. Having said that, I think it is the case that when you look at the very small number of countries that are currently run by women, they're doing pretty well. And the theory is there, that's what I covered in my book, that basically if you selected leaders, not just in politics, but in business, on the basis of their competence, integrity, people skills, empathy, and humility, you would end up with more women, for sure. And you would even end up with slightly more women than men. So maybe this is a story or a series of case studies that illustrate what we know from high volume research. But even if that is the case, to your point, it might be that those countries were already more meritocratic, more open-minded, less sexist, and therefore the women emerged there. So the chicken and egg situation, or catch-22 situation, still applies, right? Still applies. But we should ask this question, don't get me wrong, and this is why we need data scientists and people analytics experts, because you can't just throw the data. You need to have expertise to make sense of that data, and that's why all of the people watching this now will still have a job in the next few years.
Well, I hope that's true. And I also hope that they're learning from you, because you're doing what a researcher needs to do in real time. You need to ask questions, stay in curiosity, and appreciate the nuances, because many in our discipline have said, okay, this is the data we have. And then you take it up to executives and is incomplete. They're now on the defense. So what I want to just share right now with COVID-19, many leaders, political leaders, organizational leaders, they can't make good decisions because they don't have good insight. They don't have good data. And even the data that they have is way open for interpretation. So my question for you, and something I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning, is that we need more appropriate data, maybe not necessarily more data. We need more appropriate data. And sometimes that means going to create that data, maybe asking a question that is more to the point that we're trying to address, or the data might be created by somebody else, and we then go find it and bring it into our story. So can you speak to that a little bit, about staying in curiosity, appreciate the nuances, and not kind of giving up on this, this curiosity journey?
Look, I think you're absolutely right. And I would maybe not challenge, but qualify the way that you express it, or highlight the most important nuance, which is that we can say, yes, in general, the big problem for leaders now, political or business leaders, is it's a very difficult challenge. They have to make decisions with imperfect data. Nobody knows that. But hold on, because there are still visible differences between the groups they are leading, right? And we're not saying that all of those differences are because some are geniuses and they're data scientists, or they have better data, or they have a better team, but some surely are. When this is over and we have more reliable data and better indicators to compare the performance of organizations and countries, we will be better able to understand why certain leaders dealt with it better and how much they impacted the outcome. I mean, we have real-time measures now, which is the tables that I showed. You could argue in a broader sense, why is the stock share price of certain companies affected in a negative way, whereas others less so? Well, you could argue that businesses that are still doing okay have the consumer's faith or the market faith that they are, if the planet is the planet of dinosaurs and we were hit by an asteroid, right, they were better able to deal with it, right? So you could argue that companies that have done their digital transformation, that are focused more on data, that are more virtual, that sell something that isn't tangible or in the physical world, are dealing with it better. Current leaders might not be able to claim credit for it, but their predecessors were onto something. They made a bet that made them stand out. And the same for countries, by the way. You could probably conclude that the countries that are dealing with this better have certain characteristics. Their people are more educated, they have less inequality, the people trust their governments, they're more high-tech, they have better data. In some instances, they have surveillance states, so they have better data because they manage to basically snoop on people or get people to agree to that, or coerce people into that. So I think it's important to understand that some of these parameters will apply to any circumstance where leaders need to outperform their competitors. And some might be exclusive to the crisis, but I think that, to me, the most interesting aspect intellectually of the crisis is that it's helping us highlight or showcase some of the things we've known before about leadership. So it isn't that the world totally changed and that we need to, totally disrupt our thinking or our models of leadership. Actually, we can see them in action, even though it's too soon to make predictions, right? So I think, the answer is good leadership still matters, and you don't need to start from scratch. In a way, you could see the leaders that are doing well were leaders that maybe would have handled other type of challenges better.
Yeah. Again, Thomas, thank you for being who you are and elevating your voice at this time. I think it's really important that we appreciate the diverse array of way leadership shows up. And I think you're highlighting that while also staying true to the facts and taking insight that is credible, that inspires confidence in those that we're leading. So super appreciate you contributing in the way that you did today, and just in general. And again, appreciate you getting up early there in New York and sharing your insights and ideas with this European audience. So thank you. Really appreciate you.
Thank you all for having me, and good luck with the event. Thanks.